Somewhere in Russia right now, there is a machine buried in concrete that can launch a nuclear war completely on its own, with no president, no general, and no human hand needed to pull the trigger. It was built decades ago by men who are now dead, and yet many believe it is still awake, still listening, still waiting for the day the world ends. In the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was gripped by a fear that bordered on paranoia. Soviet intelligence believed the United States was preparing a decapitation strike, a sudden, overwhelming nuclear attack designed not just to destroy cities, but to kill the Kremlin leadership in the first few minutes of war. If Moscow's command structure was wiped out before it could give the order to retaliate, the Soviet Union would lose the one thing that had kept the Cold War from turning hot for 40 years, the certainty of mutual destruction. Soviet generals understood a brutal truth. Deterrence only works if the enemy believes you can still strike back even after you are dead. So they built a machine to guarantee it. The system was called Perimeter, though it would later become infamous under a different name, Dead Hand, a phrase that captured exactly what it was designed to do: reach out and pull the trigger even after the hand that built it had gone cold. Engineers and military planners worked on it in near total secrecy, hidden from the West, and largely hidden from their own government. The project was so sensitive that even within the Soviet military, only a small circle of officers fully understood how it worked. What they created was not just a weapon. It was a machine built to think for itself, in the narrow, terrifying sense that it could decide whether the world had already ended. The system worked through a network of sensors buried across Soviet territory, designed to detect the unmistakable signature of nuclear detonations: seismic shock waves, intense bursts of radiation, sudden changes in atmospheric pressure that only a nuclear weapon could produce. If multiple sensors triggered in a pattern consistent with an attack, the system would move to its next phase. It would attempt to contact the general staff in Moscow, checking for any sign of communication, any sign that someone in the chain of command was still alive and in control. If Moscow responded, the system would stand down, leaving the decision to the humans who were supposed to make it. But if Moscow stayed silent, if the system sent its signals into a command structure that no longer answered, it would assume the worst had already happened. This is where the story takes its first chilling turn. Most people assume a doomsday machine like this would be fully automated, a cold piece of software calculating the end of the world without any human involvement at all. The truth was stranger and somehow more disturbing. Soviet engineers built in one final safeguard, but it was not the kind of safeguard anyone would find comforting. Buried in a hardened bunker, cut off from the outside world, sat a duty officer, often a junior officer with no political authority and no real way of verifying what was happening above ground. If the system determined that Soviet leadership had been destroyed and that a nuclear attack was already underway, it would transfer the launch authority to this single individual. One person, alone underground, holding a decision that would determine whether the human species continued or ended within the hour. Think about what that means. The most powerful military superpower on Earth built a system whose final decision point was not a general, not a president, not a war room full of advisors debating the consequences. It was one isolated person, with limited information, expected to trust a machine's interpretation of catastrophe and act accordingly. Soviet leaders later described it as their guarantee that retaliation would happen no matter what, but to outside observers, it sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like removing the human conscience from the most consequential decision in history and replacing it with sensors and probability. For years, the existence of Perimeter was nothing but rumor in the West. American intelligence agencies had fragments of information, but nothing solid enough to confirm that the Soviets had actually built and deployed such a system. Some analysts dismissed it as Cold War mythology, a story too extreme to be real, the kind of thing you would expect from a thriller novel rather than an actual military program. That skepticism lasted until the late 1990s, when something happened that changed everything. A former Soviet military officer named Vitaly Yerenik, who had worked directly on the Perimeter system, began speaking to American researchers and journalists after the collapse of the Soviet Union. What he revealed sent a shockwave through the Western national security community. The system was not theoretical. It was not a rumor. It had been built, tested, and deployed, and according to Yerenik and other former Soviet officials, Components of it remained operational even after the Soviet Union itself had ceased to exist. The Cold War had ended. The ideology that justified the system's creation had collapsed, and yet the machine, or some version of it, was still there, still wired into the nuclear command structure of a new Russia. This is the twist that turns the story from history lesson into something far more unsettling. Dead Hand was never decommissioned the way most people assumed Cold War weapons eventually were. There was no dramatic dismantling ceremony, no treaty that specifically addressed it, because for years the West did not even officially acknowledge it existed. While world leaders shook hands over arms reduction treaties and the world breathed a sigh of relief that the nuclear standoff was finally over, a machine built to guarantee mutual annihilation sat quietly in the background, largely forgotten by the public, but very much real to the people who maintained it. Multiple former Russian officials have suggested in the years since that the system remains active in some form today, modernized and maintained as part of Russia's broader nuclear deterrent strategy. Officially, the Russian government has never fully confirmed nor denied its current operational status, which in itself tells you something about how seriously it is still treated. A system designed explicitly to guarantee retaliation even after total destruction is not the kind of capability a nuclear power abandons, no matter how the political winds shift. But the most disturbing twist in this entire story is not about Cold War politics. It is about a flaw buried inside the very logic of the system. Dead Hand was designed to interpret ambiguous signals, sensor readings, communication silence, and atmospheric data, and from those signals make a judgment about whether the apocalypse had already started. Sensors can malfunction. Communication systems can fail for reasons that have nothing to do with nuclear war, equipment failures, solar storms, simple human error. Some defense analysts have pointed out a deeply uncomfortable possibility that a single accidental detonation, a test gone wrong, a satellite misreading, or even a natural seismic event misinterpreted by overly sensitive instruments could theoretically be enough to convince the system that Moscow had been destroyed. A machine built to prevent war through guaranteed retaliation could, in theory, become the very trigger for the war it was meant to deter. During the height of the Cold War, this was considered an acceptable risk, a price worth paying for the psychological certainty that no first strike could ever succeed without consequence. Soviet strategists believed that knowing such a system existed would be enough to stop American planners from ever considering a decapitation strike in the first place, because there would be nothing left to gain. Even total annihilation of Soviet leadership would not stop the counterattack. In theory, this made the world safer. In practice, it meant the fate of hundreds of millions of people now rested partly on the reliability of sensors buried in Soviet soil and the judgment of one anonymous officer in an underground bunker, a person history never named and the public never saw. What makes Dead Hand even more haunting today is the geopolitical climate surrounding it. Tensions between Russia and the West have resurfaced in ways many believed were buried with the Cold War itself. Nuclear rhetoric has crept back into international politics. Treaties have lapsed or been suspended, and modernization programs on both sides continue to advance the very weapons systems that Dead Hand was designed to back up. The machine that was supposed to be a relic of a bygone era of paranoia now exists in a world that, by many measures, looks disturbingly similar to the one that created it. Perhaps the deepest twist of all is philosophical rather than technical. Dead Hand was never really about technology. It was about psychology, about convincing an enemy that even your destruction would not save them from consequences. It worked, in a sense, because both sides understood something simple but terrifying, that survival in a nuclear age depended not on hope, but on guaranteed mutual ruin. The machine did not need to ever actually fire in order to succeed. Its existence alone was the weapon, a silent promise buried underground that said, "Even if you kill us all, we will still kill you back." Whether Dead Hand remains operational in its original form today, or whether it has evolved into something more advanced and even less understood, one truth remains unsettling beyond words. Decades after its creation, the United States and the rest of the world still do not have complete clarity on a system explicitly designed to end civilization automatically. It sits there in the historical record as both a relic of paranoia and a warning A reminder that the most dangerous machines humanity has ever built are not always the ones that destroy first, but the ones built only to guarantee that nothing survives, no matter who started it. If you love your mom and dad, hit that subscribe button right now and show them some love. So tell me, which part of the country are you watching this from?